Maggie Carter was not the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. She lived a quiet life on her family's small farm, tucked away in the rolling hills of rural Kentucky. The days were predictable, filled with chores like feeding chickens, fixing fences, and helping her father harvest crops. It wasn't glamorous, but Maggie didn't mind. There was a certain peace in the rhythm of farm life, even if it meant waking up before dawn every day. What most people didn't know about Maggie was that she had a secret passion: shooting. Her grandfather, a retired hunter with a knack for storytelling, had introduced her to firearms when she was just 8 years old. He would sit her down after dinner, his weathered hands carefully showing her how to hold a rifle steady and aim true. "It's not about strength," he'd say, his voice calm but firm. "It's about focus, patience, and knowing yourself." Those lessons stuck with Maggie long after her grandfather passed away. By the time she turned 16, Maggie could hit a target from 50 yards away without missing. She practiced whenever she could, sneaking off to the edge of the property, with an old hunting rifle borrowed from her father. Sometimes she'd imagine herself in different scenarios: a sharpshooter in the military, a hero saving someone in danger, or maybe even a competitor at a big tournament. But those were just dreams. In reality, no one outside her family paid much attention to her skill. One Saturday morning, while running errands in town with her mother, Maggie spotted a flyer taped to the window of the general store. It advertised a local shooting competition, hosted by the county fair. The poster promised trophies, bragging rights, and cash prizes for winners. Maggie stopped in her tracks, staring at the colorful paper. Her heart raced as she read the details aloud to herself. "Open to all ages. Bring your own equipment." Her mother noticed her interest and chuckled softly. "You thinking about entering, Maggie?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You've got better things to do than waste your time on something like that." But Maggie couldn't shake the idea. What if she entered? What if she won? She didn't care about the money or the trophy. What excited her was the chance to test herself against others. Maybe it was foolish, but she wanted to see where she stood. After some thought, she decided to give it a try. The day of the competition arrived sooner than Maggie expected. She woke up early, packed her father's old rifle into the back of their truck, and drove to the range. As she stepped out of the vehicle, she felt out of place immediately. The parking lot was filled with shiny trucks and SUVs, many displaying decals of famous gun manufacturers. Men and women dressed in tactical gear walked around confidently, comparing rifles and sharing stories about past victories. Maggie, wearing faded jeans and a simple flannel shirt, blended into the background. She approached the registration table nervously, clutching the flyer in one hand. The man behind the counter glanced at her briefly, before handing over a numbered tag. "Lane 7, he said flatly, barely looking up. Maggie nodded and made her way to her assigned spot, trying to ignore the curious glances from nearby competitors. Standing near her was Jake Thompson, a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh. He wore a camouflage vest covered in patches and carried a high-tech rifle that gleamed in the sunlight. When he saw Maggie, he smirked and leaned toward another competitor. "Looks like we've got ourselves a rookie," he said loudly enough for her to hear. His friend snickered, and Maggie felt her cheeks grow warm. Next to her was Ryan Brooks, the reigning champion of the competition. Tall and athletic, Ryan moved with an air of confidence that made him seem untouchable. His eyes scanned the crowd, sizing up his opponents. When they landed on Maggie, he raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, he turned to adjust his scope, clearly dismissing her as irrelevant. Despite the whispers and sideways glances, Maggie tried to stay focused. She reminded herself why she was there: to challenge herself, not to impress anyone else. As she set up her rifle and adjusted her stance, she let her nerves settle. The familiar weight of the weapon in her hands calmed her, grounding her in the moment. Around her, the other competitors began warming up, firing practice rounds at distant targets. The sound of gunfire echoed through the air, mingling with the chatter of spectators. Maggie tuned it all out, focusing instead on the task ahead. She took slow, deliberate breaths, visualizing the perfect shot. When the organizer finally called everyone to attention, signaling the start of the competition, Maggie felt a strange sense of clarity. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She tightened her grip on the rifle, lined up her sights, and prepared to show the world what she was capable of. Little did she know, her first shot would change everything, for herself and for everyone watching. Though the odds seemed, stacked against her, Maggie knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The shooting range buzzed with energy as the competitors lined up at their assigned lanes. Maggie stood quietly in lane 7, her father's old rifle resting against her shoulder. She adjusted her grip slightly, feeling the familiar grooves of the worn wood beneath her fingers. Around her, the other shooters were busy making last-minute adjustments to their equipment or chatting confidently about their strategies. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and freshly cut grass, a mix that somehow made Maggie feel both nervous and alive. Jake Thompson, the loud man in camouflage who had smirked at her earlier, was now showing off his rifle to a small group of onlookers. "This baby cost more than your car," he joked, slapping the side of the weapon affectionately. His friend laughed, nodding in agreement. They seemed completely unbothered by the competition ahead, radiating an easy confidence that came from years of experience. Next to Maggie, Ryan Brooks stood silently, his focus sharp and unwavering. He wore a sleek black jacket with the logo of a well-known firearms brand embroidered on the chest. His rifle looked almost futuristic compared to Maggie's plain, weathered one. Every movement Ryan made was precise, calculated, as if he were performing in front of an audience rather than preparing for a contest. When he noticed Maggie glancing at him, he gave her a brief once-over before turning away with a dismissive shake of his head. Maggie didn't let it bother her. Instead, she focused on the target downrange, a small bullseye painted on a whiteboard, barely visible from where she stood. She took a deep breath, letting her mind clear of everything except the task ahead. Her grandfather's voice echoed softly in her thoughts. Focus, patience, and knowing yourself. Those words had guided her through countless hours of practice on the farm, and they steadied her now. As the organizer raised his hand to signal the start of the first round, the noise around Maggie faded into the background. The chatter, the laughter, the clinking of metal tools. All of it disappeared until all she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She raised the rifle slowly, aligning the sights with the distant target. Her finger hovered over the trigger, waiting for the right moment. When the whistle blew, signaling the beginning of the round, the range erupted into chaos. Gunshots rang out in rapid succession, each one followed by the sharp crack of bullets hitting targets. Maggie ignored the noise, keeping her attention locked on her aim. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, and then pulled the trigger. The five. Recoil was gentle but firm, just as she expected. For a moment, there was silence, not because the others had stopped firing, but because Maggie's world narrowed to a single point, the spot where her bullet had struck. She lowered the rifle and blinked, unsure if what she saw was real. The scorer standing near the targets held up a flag calling out the results. Lane 7, dead center. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Competitors paused mid-shot, turning to look at Maggie in disbelief. Even Ryan Brooks froze, his rifle halfway to his shoulder, his brow furrowed in confusion. Dead center? That kind of accuracy was rare, especially in the opening round. Most shooters needed a few tries to warm up, to get a feel for the conditions, but Maggie had nailed it on her very first attempt. Ryan recovered quickly, forcing a tight smile as he resumed his stance. Beginner's luck, he muttered under his breath, though his voice carried just enough for Maggie to catch it. She didn't respond. Instead, she calmly reloaded her rifle, preparing for the next shot. Inside, however, she felt a spark of pride. She hadn't come here seeking recognition, but proving herself, even just a little, felt good. Jake Thompson wasn't so subtle in his reaction. "What is this, some kind of joke?" he grumbled, shaking his head as he fired another round. His bullet landed close to the center, but not quite as perfect as Maggie's. Nearby, Emma Lewis, one of the few female competitors, watched silently, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied Maggie. Emma was known for her quick wit and competitive streak, and she clearly didn't appreciate being overshadowed by someone who looked like a complete amateur. Despite the growing tension, Maggie stayed focused. She knew better than to let distractions get to her. Each time she raised her rifle, she blocked out the whispers and stares, concentrating only on the target ahead. Her second shot was nearly as impressive as the first, landing just millimeters away from the bullseye. The scorer announced the result, and this time a few people clapped politely. Maggie nodded in acknowledgement but kept her expression neutral. She wasn't here to show off. She was here to compete. By the end of the first round, Maggie's scores were among the highest. Ryan still led overall thanks to his consistent performance, but the gap between them was smaller than anyone had anticipated. As the competitors took a short break to reload and regroup, Maggie stepped aside to check her rifle. She wiped away a bit of dirt from the barrel, her movements calm and deliberate. Emma approached her during the pause, arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" she said, her tone somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. Maggie looked up, meeting her gaze evenly. "I guess we'll find out," she replied simply. Emma frowned, clearly unsure how to respond. After a moment, she turned and walked back to her lane, muttering something under her breath. Maggie watched her go, then returned to her preparations. She didn't have time to worry about what others thought of her. There were still rounds to go, and she intended to give each one her best effort. As the second round began, the atmosphere at the range shifted. The initial excitement had given way to something heavier, a mix of determination and unease. Maggie could feel it in the way the other competitors moved, the way they glanced at her when they thought she wasn't looking. She had gone from being invisible to being a potential threat, and that change weighed on everyone, including herself. But Maggie refused to let the pressure get to her. She reminded herself why she was here, not to win, but to prove that she belonged. With every shot she fired, she proved just that. And as the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that Maggie Carter was not just a farmer's daughter with a borrowed rifle. She was a force to be reckoned with. The second round of the competition began, and the tension at the range was thicker than ever. The air felt heavy, charged with a mix of excitement and unease. Competitors who had breezed through the first round now seemed to hesitate, their confidence shaken by Maggie's unexpected performance. Even Ryan Brooks, the reigning champion, couldn't hide the flicker of doubt in his eyes as he glanced over at her from time to time. Maggie, however, remained calm. She stood steady in her lane, her focus unbroken. The chatter around her, whispers about her earlier shots, murmurs of disbelief, barely registered in her mind. All that mattered was the target downrange, small and distant but clear in her sights. She adjusted her stance slightly, taking a deep breath before raising her rifle once more. As the whistle blew to signal the start of the round, the sound of gunfire filled the air again. Jake Thompson fired rapidly, his shots landing close to the center but not quite perfect. Emma Lewis, determined to reclaim her position, took her time with each shot, her brow furrowed in concentration. Ryan, meanwhile, moved with precision, hitting his marks with the same skill that had earned him the title of champion. But no matter how well they performed, all eyes kept drifting back to Maggie. Her first shot of the second round echoed across the range, sharp and clean. The scorer raised his flag almost immediately. "Lane 7, dead center," he called out, his voice carrying over the noise. A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. Dead center again. It wasn't just luck. Maggie was proving herself to be a serious contender. Ryan lowered his rifle for a moment, staring at Maggie with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. He had always prided himself on being the best, on dominating every competition he entered. But here was this girl, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, holding her own against seasoned shooters with expensive gear and years of experience. It didn't make sense to him, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Jake Thompson, who had been boasting loudly at the start of the day, was now quieter. He fired another round, his usual swagger replaced by a grim determination. When his bullet landed slightly off center, he cursed under his breath, glancing at Maggie as if she were somehow responsible for his misfire. Emma, too, seemed rattled. Her shots, while still good, lacked the consistency they'd had earlier. She clenched her jaw, clearly frustrated, and muttered something about unfair advantages to a nearby competitor. Maggie paid no attention to any of it. She reloaded her rifle methodically, her movements smooth and unhurried. With each shot, she reminded herself of her grandfather's lessons: focus, patience, and knowing yourself. Those words anchored her, keeping her grounded even as the pressure mounted. She didn't care about the whispers or the stares. All she cared about was doing her best. By the end of the second round, Maggie's scores had climbed even higher. She was now tied with Ryan for the lead, a fact that sent a murmur of excitement through the spectators. People who had dismissed her earlier were now watching her with newfound interest. Some clapped politely after her shots, while others whispered theories about how she had managed to perform so well. Was it natural talent? Had she secretly trained for years? Or was there something else, something they were missing? Emma approached Maggie again during the next break, this time with a different tone. "You're better than I thought," she admitted grudgingly, though her expression remained guarded. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Maggie shrugged, keeping her response simple. "My grandfather taught me." Emma frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. "Well, don't get too comfortable," she said, her competitive edge showing. "There's still a long way to go." Maggie didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned back to her rifle, checking the barrel for any signs of wear. She knew Emma was right. The competition wasn't over yet. There were still rounds to come, and anything could happen. But Maggie also knew that she had already proven something important. She belonged here. No matter what happened next, she had earned her place among these skilled shooters. As the third round began, the mood at the range shifted again. The initial shock of Maggie's performance had worn off, replaced by a fierce determination among the other competitors. Jake fired with renewed intensity, his shots improving slightly but still falling short of perfection. Ryan, too, seemed to step up his game, hitting every target with pinpoint accuracy. For the first time that day, Maggie found herself struggling to keep pace. Her first shot of the third round landed close to the center but not quite dead on. It was still a strong shot, better than most, but it wasn't enough to match Ryan's flawless performance. The scorer announced the result, and Maggie heard a few disappointed sighs from the crowd. She ignored them, focusing instead on adjusting her aim. Her second shot was better, landing closer to the bullseye, but it still wasn't perfect. Ryan noticed the slight dip in Maggie's performance and allowed himself a small smile. Maybe she was finally cracking under the pressure. He fired another round, his bullet striking the center with ease. The crowd erupted into applause, and Ryan basked in the attention, tipping an imaginary hat to the spectators. But Maggie wasn't done yet. She steadied herself, blocking out the noise around her. She reminded herself that one imperfect shot didn't define her. What mattered was how she responded. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, she lined up her sights once more and pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed across the range, followed by a brief silence. Then the scorer raised his flag. "Lane 7, dead center." The crowd gasped, and even Ryan's smile faltered. Maggie had done it again. Despite the pressure, despite the growing stakes, she had delivered another perfect shot. This time there was no mistaking it. She wasn't just lucky. She was good. As the round continued, Maggie's confidence returned. Her next few shots were nearly flawless, bringing her scores back in line with Ryan's. By the time the whistle blew to signal the end of the round, the leaderboard showed a tight race between the two of them. Ryan was still ahead by a fraction of a point, but the gap was closing fast. Jake Thompson threw down his rifle in frustration after missing a crucial shot. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, storming off toward the sidelines. Emma, too, looked increasingly agitated, her hands trembling slightly as she reloaded. Only Ryan remained composed, though his jaw was clenched tightly as he studied the leaderboard. Maggie, meanwhile, stayed calm. She knew the competition was far from over, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. But she also knew something else. She had proven herself. Whether she won or lost, she had shown everyone and herself that she was capable of standing toe-to-toe with the best. As the organizers called for a short break before the final rounds, Maggie stepped aside to rest. She leaned against the fence, sipping water from a bottle and watching the other competitors. Some looked exhausted, others frustrated, but none seemed ready to give up. The final rounds would be the toughest yet, and Maggie knew she would need everything she had to stay in the running. Still, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. She had started the day as an outsider, ignored and underestimated. Now she was one of the top contenders, holding her own against champions and veterans alike. No matter what happened next, she had already achieved something remarkable. And as she watched the sun dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the range, Maggie felt ready for whatever came her way. The break before the final rounds gave everyone a chance to catch their breath, but no one relaxed. Not truly. The tension in the air was electric, buzzing with anticipation and unspoken rivalry. Competitors checked their rifles, adjusted their scopes, and paced nervously along the sidelines. Spectators huddled together, whispering excitedly about what might happen next. Maggie Carter stood quietly by her lane, sipping water from a bottle as she watched the scene unfold around her. Ryan Brooks leaned against the fence nearby, pretending to be calm, though his clenched fists betrayed his frustration. He had always been the star of these competitions, the one everyone expected to win. But now, for the first time, he felt uncertain. Maggie's performance had thrown him off balance, forcing him to rethink everything he thought he knew about the other competitors. She wasn't supposed to be this good. She was just a farm girl with an old rifle. How could she possibly match his years of training and experience? Jake Thompson sat on a bench, sulking. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a simmering anger. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, glaring at Maggie whenever she glanced in his direction. He couldn't understand how someone so unassuming had managed to outshoot him. It didn't make sense. Emma Lewis, pacing back and forth, shared his frustration. Her sharp eyes darted between Maggie and Ryan, calculating, strategizing. She refused to let herself fall behind, but she also couldn't deny that Maggie was a serious threat. Maggie noticed the stares and whispers, but she didn't let them bother her. Instead, she focused on staying grounded. She reminded herself why she was here, to challenge herself, not to prove anything to anyone else. Winning would be nice, sure, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. What mattered most was knowing she had given her best effort, and so far she was proud of how far she'd come. When the organizers called everyone back to their lanes for the final rounds, the atmosphere shifted again. The playful banter and casual chatter were gone, replaced by a heavy silence. This was it, the moment when champions were made or broken. Each shot would count more than ever, and even the smallest mistake could cost someone the competition. As the whistle blew to signal the start of the fourth round, Maggie raised her rifle with steady hands. She blocked out the noise around her, focusing solely on the target downrange. Her first shot cracked through the air, landing perfectly in the center. The scorer announced the result, and a few people clapped politely. Maggie reloaded quickly, preparing for her next shot. Ryan fired with equal precision, his bullet striking the bullseye just as cleanly. The crowd cheered, but Ryan barely acknowledged them. His attention was fixed entirely on Maggie. Every shot she took seemed to chip away at his confidence, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow ahead of him, not just in points, but in mindset. Where he was tense and overthinking, she was calm and focused. It infuriated him, but it also intrigued him. How did she stay so composed under pressure? Emma, too, was struggling to keep up. Her shots were still strong, but they lacked the consistency she needed to close the gap. Frustration bubbled beneath her surface, threatening to boil over. She fired another round, wincing slightly when the bullet landed just outside the center. Jake, meanwhile, had all but given up. His shots were sloppy, his aim wild. He cursed loudly after missing yet another target, drawing disapproving looks from the spectators. By the end of the fourth round, the leaderboard showed a clear picture. Maggie and Ryan were neck and neck, with Emma trailing closely behind. The final round would decide everything. Whoever performed best in the last stretch would take home the trophy and the title of champion. As the competitors prepared for the final round, the tension reached its peak. Ryan double-checked his equipment, muttering to himself as he adjusted his scope. Emma paced anxiously, her hands trembling slightly as she loaded her rifle. Jake slumped against the fence, defeated, while Maggie remained calm and steady. She took a deep breath, letting her mind clear of distractions. She visualized each shot, imagining the perfect alignment of sights and target. The whistle blew, signaling the start of the final round. Gunshots rang out across the range, one after another, as competitors fired with everything they had. Ryan hit his first target dead center, earning applause from the crowd. Maggie followed suit, her bullet landing just as perfectly. The two of them traded flawless shots, neither willing to give an inch. Emma tried desperately to keep up, but her frustration got the better of her. One of her bullets missed the mark entirely, and she groaned in frustration. Jake, who had been quiet for most of the final round, suddenly fired a shot that landed surprisingly close to the center. It wasn't enough to put him in contention, but it was a small victory nonetheless. He smirked briefly, enjoying the brief moment of redemption. With only a few shots left, the competition came down to Maggie and Ryan. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath as the two fired their final rounds. Ryan's last shot struck the bullseye with pinpoint accuracy, eliciting cheers from the spectators. Everyone turned to Maggie, waiting to see if she could match or even surpass his performance. Maggie raised her rifle slowly, blocking out the noise around her. She exhaled steadily, aligning her sights with the distant target. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then she pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed across the range, followed by a brief silence. The scorer studied the target carefully before raising his flag. "Lane 7, dead center," he called out, his voice ringing loud and clear. The crowd erupted into applause, some people cheering wildly while others simply stared in disbelief. Maggie lowered her rifle, her expression calm but satisfied. She had done it. Against all odds, she had matched Ryan shot for shot, proving herself to be every bit as skilled as the reigning champion. Ryan stood frozen, staring at the scoreboard as the final results were tallied. When the announcer declared Maggie the winner, his face flushed red with a mix of embarrassment and admiration. Slowly, he walked over to her, extending his hand. "Good job," he said, his tone grudging but sincere. Maggie shook his hand firmly, nodding in acknowledgement. Emma approached her next, her competitive edge softened by respect. "You earned it," she admitted, offering a small smile. Maggie thanked her, grateful for the recognition. Even Jake, who had spent most of the day grumbling, tipped his hat to her as he passed by. As the crowd dispersed and the organizers began packing up, Maggie stayed behind for a moment, looking out over the range. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not because she had won, but because she had pushed herself further than she ever thought possible. She had started the day as an outsider, underestimated and ignored. Now she was standing tall, her name etched at the top of the leaderboard. Her father would be proud, she thought, smiling softly. So would her grandfather. They had taught her patience, focus, and perseverance, all the things that had carried her through today. As she packed up her rifle and headed toward the parking lot, Maggie knew this was only the beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them head-on. News of Maggie Carter's victory spread quickly through the small town and beyond. By the time she returned home that evening, her phone was buzzing with notifications from friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard about her unexpected triumph. The local newspaper called to request an interview, and a radio station invited her to talk about her experience on their morning show. Maggie listened to the messages in disbelief, shaking her head as she set her rifle down on the kitchen table. She hadn't entered the competition for fame or recognition. She just wanted to see how far she could go, but now it seemed Everyone wanted to know more about the quiet farm girl who had beaten seasoned shooters. Her parents were waiting for her when she walked in, their faces glowing with pride. Her father clapped her on the back, his rough hands, warm and steady. "I always knew you had it in you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Her mother hugged her tightly, tears in her eyes. "You've made us so proud, Maggie," she whispered. For a moment, Maggie felt overwhelmed. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but seeing how happy her win had made her family made it all feel worthwhile. The next morning, reporters began arriving at the farm. They parked their cars along the dirt driveway, cameras and notebooks in hand, eager to capture Maggie's story. At first, she felt awkward talking about herself, unsure of what to say. But as she shared how her grandfather had taught her to shoot and how she practiced alone on the farm, the words came more easily. She spoke simply and honestly without trying to sound impressive or clever. People connected with her humility and authenticity, and soon her story was featured not only in the local paper, but also in larger publications across the state. Despite the sudden attention, Maggie stayed grounded. She continued helping her parents with farm chores, waking up early to feed the animals and tend to the crops. When reporters asked if she planned to compete in bigger tournaments or pursue a career in shooting sports, she shrugged. "I don't know yet," she said. "This was never about winning trophies or making money. It was about challenging myself." But others weren't ready to let her fade back into obscurity. Ryan Brooks reached out to her a few weeks later, surprising her with a phone call. "Hey, Maggie," he began, his tone cautious but respectful. "I've been thinking, we should team up for the national competition next month." Maggie blinked, caught off guard by the offer. Ryan explained that the event was a doubles tournament, requiring partners to work together. He admitted he'd underestimated her before, but now believed they could make a strong team. "What do you say?" he asked. "Are you interested?" Maggie hesitated. She had never considered competing at such a high level, and the idea of partnering with someone like Ryan, someone who had once dismissed her, felt strange. But after discussing it with her family, she decided to give it a try. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about stepping outside her comfort zone and embracing new opportunities. Training for the national competition was a different kind of challenge. Unlike the county fair, where she had relied solely on her instincts, this required strategy and teamwork. Ryan pushed her hard, drilling her on techniques she had never tried before. At first, their partnership was rocky. Ryan's competitive nature clashed with Maggie's calm demeanor, leading to moments of frustration on both sides. But as they spent more time practicing together, they began to find a rhythm. Maggie's precision complemented Ryan's speed, creating a balance neither of them had expected. Emma Lewis also reached out during this time, though her message was less friendly. "Don't get too comfortable," she warned over the phone. "I'll be there at nationals and I'm bringing my A game." Maggie chuckled softly, appreciating the playful rivalry. Emma may have been tough, but she was also fair, and Maggie respected that. Their conversations became less hostile and more lighthearted as the weeks went by, hinting at the start of a tentative friendship. As the date of the national competition approached, Maggie found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that day at the county fair. She had gone from being an outsider to a champion, earning respect from people who had once doubted her. Yet, despite the accolades and newfound confidence, she remained the same person at heart. She still loved the simplicity of farm life, the quiet mornings spent working alongside her father, and the peaceful evenings watching the sunset over the fields. On the morning of the national competition, Maggie stood beside Ryan at the range, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. The stakes were higher this time, with competitors from all over the country vying for the top prize. Some were professional marksmen with sponsorships and years of experience. Others were amateurs like Maggie, driven by passion rather than ambition. The crowd was larger too, filled with spectators eager to witness the showdown between skilled shooters. When the whistle blew to signal the start of the competition, Maggie focused on the task at hand. She blocked out the noise around her, concentrating on each shot as if it were the only one that mattered. Ryan matched her intensity. their partnership smoother now than it had been in practice. Together, they moved through the rounds with precision, their scores climbing steadily. By the final round, Maggie and Ryan were tied for the lead with another team. The tension was palpable, every shot carrying the weight of the championship. As Maggie lined up her sights for the last target, she reminded herself of her grandfather's words: focus, patience, and knowing yourself. She exhaled slowly, steadied her aim, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed across the range, followed by a brief silence. The scorer studied the target carefully before raising his flag. "Dead center," he announced, his voice ringing out loud and clear. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Ryan turned to Maggie with a wide grin. "We did it," he said, pulling her into a quick hug. Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. They had won, not because they were perfect, but because they had worked together, trusting each other to rise to the occasion. After the awards ceremony, where Maggie and Ryan accepted their trophy and medals, reporters swarmed them with questions. Maggie answered patiently, sharing credit with Ryan and thanking her family for their support. When asked about her future plans, she shrugged. "I'll keep doing what I love," she said simply. "Whether that means farming, shooting, or something else entirely, I'll figure it out as I go." Ryan nodded in agreement, adding, "One thing's for sure, this girl's got talent, and she's earned every bit of respect she gets." As the sun set on the range, casting long shadows across the field, Maggie felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had started this journey as a farmer's daughter with a borrowed rifle and a dream. Now she was standing among champions, her name known far beyond the hills of Kentucky. But more importantly, she had proven to herself that she could achieve anything she set her mind to, with focus, patience, and the courage to take the first step. The days following the national competition were a whirlwind for Maggie Carter. Her victory with Ryan Brooks had catapulted her into the spotlight, and she found herself at the center of attention in ways she had never imagined. Invitations poured, and from all directions, offers to join elite shooting teams, sponsorship deals from firearms companies, and even requests to speak at events about perseverance and breaking stereotypes. At first, Maggie felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of opportunities. She wasn't used to being in demand, and the idea of stepping away from her quiet farm life seemed daunting. But Maggie's parents encouraged her to take her time before making any decisions. "You don't have to rush into anything," her father said one evening as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. "This is your journey, Maggie. You decide what feels right." Her mother nodded in agreement. "Just remember who you are," she added softly. "No matter how far you go or how much people praise you, stay true to yourself." Maggie took their advice to heart. She spent the next few weeks reflecting on what she truly wanted. While the idea of traveling the country to compete was exciting, it didn't feel like the right path for her. Not yet, anyway. She loved the farm too much to leave it behind completely, and she knew that staying grounded in her roots would keep her humble and focused. So instead of committing to full-time competitions or sponsorships, she chose to strike a balance. She accepted invitations to a few select tournaments, ones that allowed her to travel without uprooting her life entirely. The rest of the time she stayed home, helping her parents and practicing her shooting whenever she could. Ryan Brooks became an unexpected ally during this period. After their win at Nationals, he continued to check in with Maggie, offering advice and encouragement. Though their partnership had been forged out of necessity, it had grown into a genuine friendship. Ryan admired Maggie's calm determination and willingness to learn, qualities he realized he sometimes lacked himself. "You remind me why I started doing this in the first place," he told her once after a practice session. "It's not just about winning. It's about loving the process." Maggie appreciated his honesty and began to see him in a new light. Where once she had viewed him as arrogant and dismissive, she now saw someone who was deeply passionate about his craft. Their shared experiences had bridged the gap between them, turning rivalry into mutual respect. Together, they entered a few more competitions, always performing well but never losing sight of the joy they found in working as a team. Emma Lewis also crossed paths with Maggie again, though under different circumstances. At a regional tournament, Several months later, the two women faced off in the final round. This time, however, there was no animosity between them. Emma approached Maggie before the match with a smile. "Let's make this a good one," she said, extending her hand. Maggie shook it firmly, returning the smile. Agreed. Their duel was intense, each shot bringing cheers from the crowd. In the end, Maggie edged out Emma by a narrow margin, earning another trophy to add to her growing collection. But instead of feeling defeated, Emma congratulated her warmly. "You're the real deal, Maggie," she said. "I'm glad we got to compete again." Over time, their relationship evolved from rivalry to camaraderie, and they often exchanged tips and stories about their respective journeys. Back home, Maggie's story inspired those around her. Neighbors who had once seen her as just another farmer's daughter now looked at her with admiration. Young girls in town, especially, began to view her as a role model. Several parents brought their daughters to meet Maggie, hoping she might share some words of encouragement. Maggie welcomed them warmly, telling them the same thing her grandfather had told her years ago. Focus, patience, and knowing yourself. That's all you need to succeed. Her success also brought changes to the farm. With the prize money from her victories, Maggie helped her parents upgrade their equipment and expand their operations. They installed a new irrigation system, repaired the old barn, and even bought a few additional acres of land. For the first time in years, the Carters felt financially secure, and Maggie took pride in knowing she had contributed to that stability. Despite her achievements, Maggie remained humble. She continued to wear her worn jeans and flannel shirts, refusing to let fame change her style or personality. When reporters asked how she managed to stay so down to earth, she simply smiled and said, "I'm still the same person I was before all this happened. Winning doesn't define me, it's just part of my story." As the months passed, Maggie began to see her journey not as a series of victories, but as a testament to the power of perseverance. She had started as an outsider, ignored and underestimated, and had risen to become a champion. Along the way, she had earned respect, formed meaningful connections, and inspired others to chase their dreams. But most importantly, she had stayed true to herself, proving that success didn't require changing who you were. It required embracing it. One crisp autumn morning, as Maggie stood on the edge of her family's property with her rifle in hand, she paused to take in the view. The golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the fields. Birds chirped in the distance, and the faint scent of hay lingered in the air. It was moments like these that reminded her why she loved this life, the simplicity, the beauty, the sense of belonging. She raised her rifle, lining up her sights with a distant target. Taking a slow, steady breath, she pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed through the quiet countryside, followed by the satisfying thud of the bullet hitting its mark. Lowering the rifle, Maggie smiled to herself. Whether she was competing, on a national stage, or practicing alone on the farm, shooting always brought her peace. It was a reminder of where she came from, and of how far she had come. Maggie knew there would be challenges ahead, both in her personal life and in her shooting career, but she also knew she was ready to face them. She had learned that success wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about pushing through it, learning from it, and emerging stronger on the other side. And as long as she stayed focused, patient, and true to herself, she believed she could handle whatever came her way. That afternoon, as she joined her parents for lunch on the porch, Maggie felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed dramatically since the day she signed up for the county fair competition, but at its core it remained the same. She was still a farmer's daughter, still someone who valued hard work and humility over fame and fortune. And while the world might see her as a champion, she saw herself as something simpler, a girl with a dream, a rifle, and a heart full of gratitude. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Maggie leaned back in her chair, listening to the sounds of the farm, the rustling leaves, the distant moo of a cow, the gentle hum of nature. Somewhere inside, she heard her grandfather's voice, soft but clear. "You've done good, Maggie. Real good." And for the first time in a long time, Maggie allowed herself to believe it.